afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Thank you so much for taking time on a Thursday afternoon to come to this very exciting seminar. I'm so excited, so delighted. We've got loads to talk about. But before we get into it, I'd like to introduce Mr. Stephen Erikson here to my right. So Stephen Erikson, as I'm sure you all know, is the author of the 10-volume epic fantasy series, The Malazan Book of the Fallen. Did I get that right? Malazan. As well as other books of fantasy, science fiction, and contemporary fiction. Prior to becoming a full-time writer, he worked as an archaeologist for 18 years. He holds degrees in anthropology, fine arts, and is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop. His latest publication is this lovely book called Rejoice, A Knife to the Heart, a first contact science fiction novel. He lives in Victoria, British Columbia in Canada, which is a very long way from here. So thank you so much for joining us.
Delighted to be here.
Great. And by way of introduction, my name is Nashua Gallagher. I am a local poet, Hong Konger, and have many other hats. But for the purposes of today, I am your moderator to hopefully have an engaging conversation around this book and around anthropology, world building, and just the building blocks of science fiction, fantasy, diaspora, all of that good stuff. So let's get into it.
Sounds good.
Cool. So first of all, this book is really, really great. I was saying to Stephen that there are parts of it I would just sort of pause and have a think about because it is incredibly thought-provoking. It's almost philosophical in the questions that they raise. Much of it that sort of drives you back to the big question, I suppose, which is what does being human mean in a modern context? And if we did have first contact from another outside sort of space being, what does that mean for who we are, what we believe in, and just even the structures that hold up our worlds, our basic economy, our ideologies, are they as strong as we think they are? Spoiler alert, they're not. Are they? So
yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the book, the inspiration behind it?
Sure. Actually, it was in my head for about 10 years before I finally started, or finally convinced myself to sit down and write it. And I approached it, I guess, from an anthropological perspective. I was thinking, I've watched and I've read every first contact novel imaginable. And I've watched every first contact film I've ever seen, or has ever been made. And one of the things that struck me was none of them really seemed to address the primary emotional response that would occur. And so when I was thinking about it, I thought, well, if a vessel, an alien vessel, were to publicly land in a place where no government can hide the evidence of its appearance, if those aliens wanted to conquer all of Earth, they wouldn't have to do a single thing because we would do it for them. And the reason why I think that is we will face at that point an existential crisis that will probably dismantle most of our institutions and our belief systems.
So light stuff there.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think that's really great setup because the more you read the book, it's quite confronting from, I guess, three ways. The first one is it's truly written from a global perspective, which is ambitious and wonderful, because I think anyone reading this will recognize the governments as we know them now and how sort of that narrative has been in the media of sort of governmental sort of personalities. They come to the fore. But also this idea of, scarcity. So at one point, the benefactors, as it's referred to in this book, take away sort of the need not take away, but provide food and shelter and all the basic needs that one would want to, what one would need to, just sort of function in the world. And then it sort of begs really interesting questions, like if I didn't have to go to work tomorrow in its most crudest forms, what would I do? Or why would I do it? Would I just create stuff? Would I be part of a different community? Would I be living somewhere else? So it was really, really clever in the fact that we're reading this happening in a context that we all understand in our world, but then it sort of asks those questions, throws those questions back to the reader of, well, if this were to happen, what would I do? And then perhaps worryingly, oh, why hasn't it happened? This is actually not that bad. Maybe we do need something this dramatic to kind of, shake us all about a little bit.
I think I've reached the point of the conviction that, yes, we will need an external agent of some form to trigger us into a kind of collective and communal response to what's happening and what will be happening, especially with regard to things like climate change and all the rest. And of course, one of the problems we have is we have a recourse to violence.
Yes.
And it's not just individual violence, but it's an institutional or statewide and between states. Violence can, in a sense, become the knee-jerk response to stress. And so as the environments get worse, as water gets scarcer, as populations begin moving in order to find food, they're going to run up against borders, and that's where violence begins. And then people are going to prey on these dislocated people as well. So one of the things I wanted to do with this alien intervention was to basically create a kind of real-time active agency that prevents violence. And then I asked myself, well, what will happen if no one's anger is allowed to have any kind of physical expression? And so it cannot choose victims. And the only rule I gave was suicides were permitted because the element of free will had to be at least acknowledged in some fashion.
So that was the third element that I neglected to mention, the kind of emotional response or the emotional piece to it, because biologically, one could argue we're primed to survive. And from that context, aggression can be very useful. Anxiety and fear can be very useful. So if we strip away the need or strip away the avenue to express that aggression, where does that leave people? So in this idea of a post-scarcity world where all your needs are being met, what does that, if we look at it from the context of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if everything's ticked off, would the person at the end still be motivated? And
it's a good question. This novel is primarily asking questions. I don't know if I have the answers.
I noticed that, actually. Yeah. It was great.
Yeah, it asked the questions, what if? And personally, I would guess that we would see a dramatic shakeup of social structure right across the board. And with communication, the only option, so in other words, without physical violence, all you can do is communicate. That would be the driving force to any changes that occurred. But at the same time, there will be people who will choose to do nothing. And our entire civilization is geared towards a value system that is founded upon labor or money.
Yeah.
And so once you've taken those necessities away, you're actually removing the value systems of a culture, which means it needs to find new ones. And of course, that would be the very, very difficult thing.
And I think this is part of why I personally love dystopian fiction or sci-fi. It's another way of examining ourselves and re-examining our values, but with a different context. So whether we're aliens or it's a post-apocalyptic world, it I think at its most essential, it tries to discover what are our base instincts and how do we apply them in the most humanist form, and does that definition of what makes a human human change? And I think that's why it's such a great genre. That's why I personally love it, because I think it's a genre full of hope, even as we're, as it might be set in the most devastating of circumstances. Not this book in particular, but what this book does do in particular is it sort of augments things. Observations I made just on the fly, things like, I was really interested in your female characters because you examine the power play really well. So as these events are unfolding, the book goes to different parts of the world and different sort of contexts, whether it's the media mogul and his trophy wife, or it's the PR woman who works for two very wealthy twin brothers who quite literally think of themselves as gods. And the protagonist is a very smart, strong, chain-smoking, redheaded, very, visceral almost character.
Yeah, I was trying to put together, I think, Margaret Atwood and Ursula Le Guin.
Yes.
Just fuse them together, yeah.
It was very effective. I want to be her best friend, if she ever does descend back into Earth. But could you talk a little bit about highlighting those parts of humanity that we would much rather, sweep under the rug, whether it's inequality or whether it's things like the drug trade or the arms trade. That was another storyline, because there were some very devastating parts.
I'm not too sure how to comment on that. I think, I wanted to sort of touch on all aspects, as many aspects as I can, as I could, on how people would respond. So you have somebody who blogs, and you have the leaders of primarily 4, I guess, major countries. 3 plus Canada. I don't think you can count Canada as a major country. But and my original premise was actually to contact a number of other science fiction authors and to get them interviewed in the book. And the only one I managed to get was Robert Sawyer. So he is actually a character in the novel. One of the things that I always found frustrating was with first contact novels is who's making that first contact? Usually it's an astronaut. And generally astronauts are derived from military backgrounds with a few PhDs added onto them. Or it's a scientist. But scientists are not traditionally known as fantastic communicators. There's a few exceptions to that. But so in other words, it was or government leaders, and of course every government leader has their own agendas and their own property or possessions in terms of power to protect. So none of these things which you see on film and television with first contact seem to be the right people to be the first ones to say hello to an alien. Would you all be happy with President Trump stepping up and saying hi, representing all of humanity?
At this point.
No. And so basically what I came up with was why not choose a character who has made a career out of thinking about aliens and alien species. And so accordingly, the main character who is abducted at the beginning of the book is a science fiction author. And I don't consider myself a science fiction author. I'm primarily a fantasy author, so there's no Mary Sue stuff going on here. But it just occurred to me that is somebody that I would be more comfortable with in the first contact situation than anyone else, including anthropologists. I think a science fiction writer would be the first choice, at least for me.
And I think it also underpins this great idea, which was expressed by, the AI who contacted it, which is the reason we chose you is because what we value about the Earth, and I'm paraphrasing, so please do, correct me if I'm wrong, is the biome. The biome is precious. Life on Earth is valued by anyone external looking in. And secondly, your capacity to imagine and dream and create is also held up as a signifying feature of why we should perhaps keep humans around.
Yeah, and I think I probably borrowed a fair bit from Ian Banks' culture novels, which is a post-scarcity collection of works in the far future for humanity, where if you are in post-scarcity, and I don't believe that resources are at all scarce in space. I think it's probably more resources than we can imagine out there. I suspect as well there's more life out there than we could ever imagine. But so you're not going places to extract resources necessarily in the hopes of making money and selling it back at home, whatever. So what would be the value systems? What would be valued in a pan-galactic collection of civilizations? And the only thing that occurred to me would be art, because art is the only thing that is unique to each species, and unique to a culture, which is, of course, not a permanent culture. All cultures change and pass through time. So that would be the only value system that would be of any worth to a pan-galactic civilization. So,
just digesting. That's great, because it creates, for me, as you were saying that, I guess the realization for me, one of the reasons I really enjoyed this is that dichotomy, right? It's that understanding, or that very strong statement of first contact being made because so much value is put on all forms of life in the biome and art. And it's contrasted with the characters that we alluded to earlier, some of them who have led horrible lives before you take away all forms of aggression or the capability of them to harm other people. And it's sort of holding up a lens to some of the worst examples of humanity, but reconciling that with it's still all good. There's still hope, there's still chance. And I think
I think redemption has to be in.
Yes.
Personally, it's one of my rules. I think I would never produce a novel that made everyone want to kill themselves by the end of it. I need that sense of redemption, the possibility of redemption, regardless of the characters. And so, I for a number of characters, I went for the most heinous, despicable style characters, and then I decided to just follow them and see where it took them.
I love that about it. Just very frankly, loved that about it, because not easy to read, but by the end of the book, there was a sense of satisfaction that it all worked within this new paradigm. The sense of frustration, the sense of anger, the sense of, the world having moved on, and how each of these different characters respond to it is really interesting. And it's not, it's not one brushstroke. It's still varied, but I personally thought it was a very, very interesting sort of feature of the book. And as you said, it asks so many questions, some written, some that just get inspired from reading it. So if you haven't got a copy yet, please get one and read it and talk it through with a friend, because you will need to afterwards. I've already promised to loan this to about 4 different people after. So, well, thank you for that. Can I ask a question just around, so this sort of idea has been in your head for a while and you're motivated to write it, but how on earth do you even approach the science behind it? Because there are, just in terms of the ships and in terms of, it does go into the technical aspects of it. How does one research that sort of thing?
I made the mistake of traveling down the rabbit hole that is UFO conspiracy theory. And that took me 4 or 5 years worth of reading and YouTube, watching lectures and all the rest.
Oh, goodness.
A lot of that is already present, so there's nothing sort of strictly invented by myself. Basically, you will find people writing, scientists, usually ex-NASA scientists, ex-JPL, who are writing about 0-point energy sources and gravity drives and all the rest. I mean, it's all out there, and it's just once you start finding it, you just get led further and further in.
It's quite literally all out there, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So why don't we move to, I guess, the meat of the seminar, which is world building and anthropology. Should we start with what is it? What are we talking about?
Yeah, world building. Within the context of fantasy, world building is one of the major sort of subjects of discussion and debate among fans, as well as, I guess, among writers. And so there are many different approaches to how you world build within something like fantasy. But I want to sort of step back and make the more blanket statement that world building exists in all fiction. In fact, as we were talking earlier, it exists in poetry as well. And it exists in the sense of what you choose to include as details in your narrative versus what you choose not to include. So if you want to take, say, a contemporary work, contemporary fiction set here on Earth, if you were to choose one part of the city of Paris, you will build a particular world in a sense and for the readers, a tone and an atmosphere that is specific to that one place in Paris. But you cross the river and it's a completely different place. So for world building for contemporary fiction, quite often it's the kind of research that requires you to visit a place, stay in it for a while, or I know some writers can get away with just online research and encyclopedias and that kind of thing. But what they're all doing is they're attempting to create something called verisimilitude, which is a sense of authenticity, a sense of reality that you as the reader feel you can trust in what the writer is having to say. And so, you know, a writer's creating a novel set in New York who's never left Northwest Saskatchewan probably will not convince many people. So that is kind of the basic approach for all forms of fiction is you build that world and then your characters inhabit that world and the readers are taking a lot of aspects for granted because they know what New York looks like, they know what Paris looks like, etc. But when you step into a fantasy world, you're starting from scratch. And at that point, that's when the questions start arising.
And that sense of authenticity, that consistency, that sort of immersion, if you will, I mean, it sort of lends itself to one of the best things about reading a book, that total departure and just falling into a different world. How could you talk about your process? How would you approach that? How would you start?
I would start by thinking in terms of if people think of fantasy as like epic fantasy, as escapism, I think they're kind of missing the point. What epic fantasy does, and what it has always done, is it presents a distorted mirror of the world and the context of the author, where they were living, when they were living, etc. And so the novel becomes a kind of a fictional dialogue between someone outside this world and someone in this world. And so the reader comes at it from this world, and subconsciously, at least, they are engaging in that dialogue. So when I think of a fantasy setting in a fantasy world, I'm thinking of a blank slate where I can create things that actually comment on our world.
And as we spoke about earlier, I think that is part of the value, isn't it? It's that distorted mirror. It's actually discussing very common or very human sort of principles from our own world, but just looking at it from a slightly different angle, rather.
And you have to kind of, you fake it, because you choose details, usually small, mundane details, that are recognizable to the reader. So it can be as simple as a saddle on a horse, or a horse for that matter, or rivers that flow downhill as opposed to something else. Seasons, anything along those lines that we will immediately recognize to help us anchor ourselves. And so I've described them here as mundane details, physicality, most physical laws, most biological laws. Of course, any one of these things can be altered and changed in some aspect. So you can create species that do not exist, except in your imagination. And that's done fairly often for science fiction. But fantasy, there is a tendency to sort of, I'll just create dwarves and elves and orcs. And all you're doing is basically you're building on a pre-established set of tropes, which I think the genre has moved beyond for the most part.
Easier said than done, though, because even when we're talking about laws of physics, the sort of basic tenets of even things like gravity, zero gravity, from the context of this book, there's the research that goes into it, then there's the rationale, but there's a hell of a lot of editing in between, isn't there? Because to pull it off elegantly and to write it in a way that is believable, or certainly that takes the reader from one sort of, the beginning of the chapter to the end, that's I've always admired that, because that's something I personally, as a writer, I struggle with, because that's something that takes confidence to know what to omit. Mm-hmm. How do you approach that? What's the sort of, when we're looking at scientific principles, how do you know which ones to cut out and continue on with the story?
I think for myself, a general sense of, for the Malazan world anyways, and bear in mind that it's a co-created world between myself and Ian C.S. Lamont, and we gamed this world, so we role-played it. And that was a way of testing out the functionality of the things we invented and the things we slipped in there. But I think I would actually, and I have argued this before, shocking an audience of primarily contemporary fiction, literary writers and fans, by saying that there is nothing more difficult than fantasy as a genre. There is nothing more difficult. You can get away with tacitly agreed assumptions of the world in any other kind of novel, even a science fiction novel, where it is deriving from some origin, human origin, but is projected into the future. With fantasy, you have to literally start from scratch. And so the anthropological approach is, I would take the setting and decide what kind of technological level I wanted this thing to be operating at, and how vast a landscape I wanted to employ. We ended up employing an entire planet, multiple continents, and the nature of cultures within that world that are shaped primarily by their environments. The cliched bad fantasy stuff. Like, I remember when I was young, I bought a box set of the role-playing game Forgotten Realms, and brought it home and pulled out the map, and looked at the map and realized that this map, in terms of geomorphology, made no sense at all. Rivers flowed in the wrong directions. They flowed into mountains, not out of them. You had a city of dwarves basically 10 miles away from a city of humans, no farmland. I don't know what they were eating. And so those kind of frustrations really drove both myself and my co-creator, who's also an anthropologist, to make sure that we had as much veracity as possible in the creation of this world, so that it would be recognizable, so that seasons, subsistence patterns, resources, all of these things would actually shape and define the cultures that arose from those places. And then being anthropologists, we're fascinated with cultures in contact, cultures in conflict, and the changes that occur when that happens. But the big question, of course, is magic, because magic changes everything.
Well, that's what I was going to ask. How do you feel about genre mixing? Is it a cop-out if you're writing sci-fi and then go, I can't work something out, I can't work out how to get that, move the story along, I know I'm going to throw some magic into it?
Well, you mean like Star Wars?
I mean, I wouldn't want to,
Yeah.
raise the name in vain. But, as a thought experiment, yes, like Star Wars.
Yeah. I don't have a problem with it. I always think a lot of hardcore science fiction, and especially space opera style, has actually, it is lent too much in one direction. And that one direction is promulgating this notion of a mechanistic universe.
Good and evil.
Well, a mechanistic universe in the sense that there is no aspect or space for spirituality in a lot of science fiction. Even Star Trek, it basically presents the idea that we've outgrown our religions. I think that's utter nonsense. I think these things need to actually move with each other. So I was quite pleased in the sense that Star Wars made a point of actually dragging both high tech into that setting, plus a spiritual or philosophical approach as well.
I suppose we could say the same for even the likes of Harry Potter.
Yeah.
Towards the end, and even in your book, you made the point a couple of times, which is really interesting, of when first contact has been established, is it necessarily evidence that there is no higher power? And the AI themselves sort of claim, well, no, there is no definitive answer.
No.
That is the point. And I think that was really refreshing to read. So I thought that was a really, really great to see that point sort of in the book and in this discussion as well. So on the sort of similar vein, the whole good and evil thing, as exemplified by Star Wars, I've always personally struggled with that because, again, comparing it to other sort of contemporary sort of fantasy fictions like Harry Potter, I love Professor Snape because, as J.K. Rowling said, you can't make him good, you can't make him evil, he's just all grey. Yeah. And I think that's one of the greatest sort of strengths of fiction, that brings that to the surface, that we don't have to, as much as we live in idealized Instagram versions of our lives, it is all really grey in the end. It's
all grey, and certainly there's been a tradition of simplifying conflict within fantasy to the Dark Lord or the evil wizard or whatever. But for the Malazan series, we were consciously pushing away from that idea. So it's all gray. It's all gray areas. So good people do bad things and bad people do good things. So
well, that's the other distinction, isn't it, with when you're looking at historical fiction or just any historical account, history is indeed written by the victors. Yep. And we're able to correct that with fiction or fantasy or any other forms of writing.
Well, yeah, and especially, and I'm going to get to this later when I talk about point of view and how point of view can, I don't know how many beginning writers or writers are kicking around out here in the audience, but point of view itself is the crucial means by which you build your world. But recognizing that each specific character's point of view is a very, very limited section of that world. And so it allows you to truncate the necessity or the impulse to info dump and to pile information on, expositional information, giving the background of the world in the first two chapters. If you stick close to a character, they don't know any of that. So you stay with them, and then you can piecemeal drop in elements of the world building as you go. So multiple points of view was one one of the things I sort of stumbled on very early on and realized just how potentially useful it was, because nobody shares the same worldview, and so each one is unique, and it's like each one is casting, a handful of clay onto an invisible rock, and when you get enough of them in there, you've got the shape of the rock, but you don't have to describe the rock, so you just stay with those characters.
Yes, and we saw that with, as you mentioned in the book itself as well, where one element of living in this, again, going back to the idea of a post-scarcity world, for some of the characters that meant that their immediate needs were met and the pressure was off of them. For others, it was the dawn of the end of capitalism as we know it, and it was panic stations everywhere.
Yeah.
So
Wouldn't that be nice? Yeah. I think I just fell into the habit of doing that in the sense of creating characters to give us as many angles of approach as possible to any particular subject or theme. I do like inverting expectations in that respect as well.
And I think, you alluded to a anthropological structure when you're world building. Is there a cheat sheet on that? How do you approach it? Like, what's the first? Is it landscape? Is it culture? What's the first point?
All of these things are they're all interconnected. So where you start actually doesn't matter. But you create a map, you create a landscape, geomorphology, geography, all the rest, and that actually helps define the nature of the cultures that will arise in that place. So it'd be the example would be, say, the far north in the Arctic Circle. You would be looking primarily at hunter-gatherers, small groups, small bands, primarily meat-eating, with a fairly small toolkit, but very efficient toolkit. And then within that basic structure, then you're looking at, and what I would recommend is you find textbooks, university textbooks that are out of date in used bookstores, from all kinds of subject matter, and just plumb them, because it's very useful. So to continue the Arctic example, you'll have something what's called a postpartum sex taboo, which is a means by which when, and this is prior to European contact, but when a child is born within a band, the mother does not produce another child for 5 years minimum. And the reason for doing that, of course, is if you produce too many children and then you go to a period in which food is scarce, then everyone suffers for it. Yeah. And then you can look at things like reciprocity, which preceded monetarism and the modern economies. And so there are all kinds of sort of specific recorded ethnographic, ethnological data that helps you to build cultures that make sense. And so each one will then have its own value system as well. And one of the risks, of course, is you bring too much from this world into that world, and it unduly influences the choices you make. And I'll get to that in a second.
Great. Technological levels or technology levels, how do you decide? Is it plot driven, or is it?
I think it's what interests you. I mean, I read fantasy. I grew up reading Edgar Rice Burroughs, which were basically romantic fantasies. And so, my interest was to do something, with swords and fairly basic approach, a late Iron Age kind of thing. Rather than, and I've seen some fantasies that are, gunpowder fantasies, and then they're quite interesting in and of themselves. We're crossing genres at that point, but I think what people think of when they look at fantasy is the heroic kind of format, and so individual combat tends to be sort of central to the idea of these stories and that world. But again, with magic, everything changes. And this is the thing that both Cam, my co-creator, and myself discovered, that if you define magic as being, say, for example, egalitarian and something that is accessible to everyone through discipline and hard work, then we asked ourselves, well, what would be the consequences of something like that actually on culture and on civilization? And the first thing we came up with, and the first obvious thing, was that we could no longer have civilizations that sustain gender-based hierarchy of power. If power is accessible to everyone, then all of those mechanisms that we can see in the world around us, patriarchy, matriarchy for that matter, but primarily patriarchy, which imposes limitations upon half the population, is no longer viable. And so not only is it not viable, it would never have occurred to the people in the Malayan world that such a thing was even possible. And so suddenly we realized we were going to be writing in a setting that had no sexism, period. But because everybody grew, all the characters grew out of that world, they wouldn't be talking about it either. So we couldn't signpost it. In fact, it took about, by the third volume, before somebody actually, a fan raised a hand and said, well, there's no sexism here. Well, yeah, that's the point, right?
Yeah.
So this is what fantasy and world building can actually achieve within fantasy, is that you can change the rules of the game. And quite often what happens is writers will get fairly lazy on this, and so you'll get that kind of Eurocentric transposition onto a fantasy world, where the barbarians are in the north, the hordes are in the east, the decadent south, and then you've created something with medieval social structure, so nobility, classes, castes, or whatever. And suddenly, having done all that, not only have you then limited the potentiality of women in that story and in that novel, because all they're there is to be married off to the princes and or whatever. But you've also kind of brought across as an assumption from our world into a fantasy world something that appears to be and will appear like a natural law. In other words, patriarchy as natural law. So in other words, you carry it over, you don't question it, and therefore it must be a natural law. And of course with magic, magic's the equivalent of the machine gun on the medieval battlefield. Anybody can pull the trigger. Yeah. So once you've done that, there's no way you can actually justify the laziness that was involved in simply bringing something across without questioning it and without examining it. And so a lot of what I talk about with world building for writers is you actually have to take a look at the story you want to write and the world you want to create and examine critically all of your assumptions. What comes across with it? And can you do without them? Can you actually make a point of getting away from those so-called natural laws and making a statement that references back to our world?
Well, that's fascinating. So it's what you put in, but what you also emit, deliberately emit. And it's remarkable to me that it got to 3 books before anybody noticed. But isn't that the idea?
Yeah, and many female protagonists in the novels. Many of them soldiers, magic users, whatever. And yeah, we didn't think anything of it in terms of writing the novels, but yeah, it's taken a long time for people to actually address that particular subject matter.
So what strikes me as really impressive about this whole process is well, first of all, we all know writing is not linear, isn't it?
It's what?
It's not linear. It's not this is my sort of outline, and I'm going to follow it exactly, because where would the fun be in that? Again, that could just be an opinion. It could not be. That blanket statement may not apply to everyone. But there's all these things to consider in terms of culture, in terms of biases, perception, what underlying point you want to make or don't want to make. How do you weave the plot into that? I mean, when does the plot come in?
Yeah, no kidding. And that's the thing with fantasy, with writing fantasy novels, is you're having to subtly build the world, almost so that the audience, the reader, don't notice that you're building the world. Because once you give that info dump, it becomes clunky.
Yeah. Once you explain the writing as you're writing it, I think people close the book and walk away.
And then you're placing characters within there that each of them has their own worldview and is coming from what is for the reader an alien culture, an alien civilization, an alien value system, for that matter. And then if you make gods active in the world, then you have to question or work out what are their motivations, what are they up to. And all of these things then lead you towards basically what you need to assemble in order to deliver whatever theme you want to explore. And for me, I've often described, I wrote the Malazan Book of the Fallen in 11 years. It took 8 years to find a publisher. But once I got started, 11 years for 10 volumes and a total word count of about 3.25 million words.
Wow.
So, yeah, and there was a lot of small themes. Like, so the novels, the only cliffhangers are between books 9 and 10. So all the elements are standalone novels. So I needed a plot structure that actually made it satisfying to get to the end of each novel without having to wait for the next one. And so it was, I guess, I don't know, I think when I look back on it, and I have described it this way, my primary interest thematically never changed through the entire series. And it probably does not change through every book I write, which is, I've often described the 10-book series as a 10-volume plea for compassion. And that's what I want to explore in characters. And so that notion of compassion, we spoke of redemption earlier, all of these things, I wanted to be integral to the development of the characters within the stories. And that's what drove the plot.
And do you think, it strikes me as a feature of sort of alternative worlds, or whether it's fantasy or magic or dystopia, what have you, that if you look at George R.R. Martin with the Song of Ice and Fire series, he's, I think, just released another prequel, which for all of us waiting to see how it ends in the books is fine, I suppose. But also Tolkien did it as well. There's so much stuff, and at some point you think, well, I've got another 2 million words on this. I might as well, add another volume into it.
Maybe. I mean, it can become quite obsessive, world building in itself. A lot of people who are into role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons and stuff. And I remember running into some who've spent half their lives building this, whatever world they've created for their gaming. I don't think that is what produces a novel or a novelist or a writer. I think that stuff is more encyclopedic kind of approach to building a world, and it's as creative as one could imagine, but it doesn't have, it's not being propelled by anything except its own creation. And so there needs to be something external, something that is obsessing the author, the writer, to actually drive them, push them into that world, and then pull them through, all the way through out to the end. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
This conversation's been...
Hold on a sec. I'm slowly tracking up, so if anybody sort of wanted to be taking pictures, I can go back and do this all over again in a sec. But just to give you, it's kind of a tips, and it's kind of a shorthand on creating and world building. And there are many, many other ways of approaching this. This is just the one that I guess I promulgate.
Yeah, I was just going to say this has been really illuminating in terms of obviously understanding the process for this book, but then also amplifying it with the wider kind of genre, and even that point about, well, there are loads of prequels and lots of other books to add color and maps and languages and drawings and fan art, so much fan art. And I think it's really wonderful. It's almost all the work that you put in sort of, it does go on to inspire people so they want to create around it, to participate.
You would not believe how many fans send me pictures of their tattoos, basically drawn from the melasma stuff.
How does that feel?
And other fans telling me that they've named their first child after a character in the books. It's a bit alarming, actually.
Again, going to Game of Thrones, there were several news reports of parents regretting calling their daughters Khaleesi or Daenerys after, the way the series continued.
I think I know of at least 2 thrash metal bands that are inspired by the books as well. And yeah, strange.
What could you think could top it? Would it be? So we've got tattoos, we've got a thrash metal band, we've got children. I think you've got the full gamut. I think that's all the sorts of things that mean something to people.
Yeah, I've yet to receive a note saying I want your baby. So I'm considering myself lucky at that point.
Things to hope for.
Yeah.
So shall we actually go through this document? Because if there are any budding writers in the audience, it's really, really useful to sort of create a frame or follow a framework to help you come up with your own world and go from there.
I can. I mean, I've sort of been doing it quietly as we've been talking anyway. So once you've brought things like immortal beings into the sort of kind of physical interaction with mortal characters, you will always be faced with the challenge of, well, how do I create the point of view of a god? And I discovered very early on, not to even try. Stay with the people on the ground, and but then acknowledge that these people are from a setting that actually has the possibility of being visited by a god and speaking to a god. And then you think in terms of, well, what are the power dynamics involved here? To what extent does worship actually empower a god, and the removal of worship weaken the god? So who's really in charge here? And so that kind of playing around with hierarchy and inverting hierarchy and inverting tropes. And I think fantasy as a genre has definitely reached the point where many writers are much more comfortable inverting tropes and subverting the tropes, because they are quite cliched now, and to get around them is probably required. Anyways, so we got setting. Most of the stuff's pretty straightforward. Yeah, and this is, I remember getting on to, it was either Goodreads or Reddit Fantasy or something, and putting in an essay basically saying this, because is everybody aware of the term grimdark as a subgenre of fantasy? Yes, grimdark.
Grimdark?
Yeah, but conflated.
Right.
Grimdark. It's basically, I would say it derived out of the UK with writers like Mark Lawrence, maybe some of Joe Abercrombie. It's a kind of, it's a gray area of fantasy, but also one that is not necessarily positive in its outlook.
Okay.
And so it's very dark, very gritty, very visceral. The violence is often very graphic. And so I ended up writing an essay that triggered quite a long conversation among fans and other writers, basically because I said, I don't know if this is actually a worthwhile thing to be doing. And the idea of, again, what you bring across from this world into whatever the fantasy world you're creating. Writers are no longer people that hide from the public and present only their work. Things have changed to such an extent that writers have become public persona, online, Facebook, etc. Accordingly, whatever we put in a book, whatever we put in a story, we potentially have to answer for immediately, because the responses are so quick now. And so given that, I was basically advising beginning writers to think very carefully about what they bring into that other world, and be prepared to justify it if challenged. And there was some resistance to that notion, that whatever goes in fiction, anything goes in fiction, and it doesn't really bear on me whatsoever. I don't know if I entirely agree with that. I think these days, what you choose to write can come back on you easily.
I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, and readers are fully within the right to do so, because we have become much more public in our personal, like Stephen Erikson. It's not just a name on the book anymore, right? I have a Facebook page, I have a blog page, and all the rest, and so I'm in dialogue, constant dialogue with readers, and then for me it just made sense that I better be able and be prepared to back up my choices in my fiction.
And accountability and censorship are not at odds with each other. I agree with the notion that free speech is incredibly important, but if you're called out on it, then you've got to back
and
it
if you
up.
made a mistake, mea culpa, right?
Yeah,
You just,
absolutely.
rather than get defensive about it. So that's
and also
kind
it's
of
fiction. I think that helps. Right?
Yeah.
We're not writing the
Well,
history of the world.
Yeah, I mean, there's two main sort of sides to the debate as I saw it coming out years ago between two authors in America, John Gardner, who wrote works what he called and built a theory called on moral fiction, and William Gass, who said, no, just because so and so on got raped on page 24, there was no rape because it's fiction, and so anything goes. And so those are the two. Whereas Gardner would say, no, actually, you have to acknowledge your audience, and you have an ethical responsibility, not only towards the audience, but towards your characters and towards the integrity of the story. And so if you are reveling in scenes of violence just for the gratuitous, impact of doing so, that's, to me, that is saying something about the author. And so when I see that kind of stuff, I kind of recoil.
Understandably.
Yeah, I think violence, there needs to be a price paid, and I would not throw the blame at authors as a general statement, because I think the trend began with film and television, where you had your basically sociopathic heroes who could walk away from the burning building and not care about the 50 people they just killed. And all they would do is look cool on the screen. And I think that kind of image has sort of filtered its way into things like fantasy and science fiction and other, comic books and all the rest. And I find that troubling, I have to admit.
I think that's an excellent point in terms of the value of reading something and the value of a well-defined world that's written versus represented on the screen, because you can't have it like for like. The age-old argument of the book is always better than the film. I can think of a couple of instances where I don't agree, but I'm not going to stake my life on those. But
Children of Men. Do you remember Children of Men?
Lord of the Rings. I would say.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I mean,
yeah.
controversial, but it's particularly for its time, the quality of the films was just mind-blowing. Everyone left the cinema going, that was the coolest thing I've done this week. And we don't get that with the Avengers. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm a Marvel girl. I really, really enjoyed it. And it's a great, great sort of popcorn series, but same thing. New York City is being destroyed. Hundreds, thousands, millions of casualties.
It wasn't
No one
just
cares.
Avengers. That was a very strange thing. Star Trek, the second reboot, had the Enterprise crash into San Francisco, the entire spaceship crash, and presumably killing tens of thousands of people. Which 10 minutes later, Spock and Kirk are given the keys to the new ship, and told to head off, and they're all happy. They're high-fiving each other.
It's egregious.
No
isn't it?
thought at all of the body count behind them.
Yeah.
And you'll get the same thing in the Superman film. Can't remember what it was called, Man of Steel. I mean, again, it seemed as if there was a psychological need, at least from American filmmakers, to continually revisit the Twin Towers collapse, but to actually sanitize it so that you see survivors stumbling out of the dust, but you never see the victims. You never see the bodies being pulled out. And it repeated in film after film after film. It was quite extraordinary. And I think it also may have ultimately desensitized a lot of the audience to even the idea of cities being blown up.
For sure. I think, and we've seen that even with video games, right? We see that with video games that 12-year-old, like online games that 12-year-olds are playing now. And, as a parent, yes, there's concern, but it's a wider societal concern because there is an element of art and play acting and role playing, which has to be respected. But there's also an element of, have we really normalized this to the extent that my 12-year-old is killing blocky, representations of his friends and laughing?
And because special effects have gotten so good, we are ritualizing the experience of violence.
That's an excellent point.
Yeah.
I'm going to remember that, ritualizing the experience of violence. So going back to, sorry, we've gone off on a little bit of a tangent here.
That's
because
all right.
It's super interesting. But going back to the point on just the different screens, the different portrayals between books and movies and different ways to consume media. And your earlier point on everything you write is it fair to say, a basic objective of you want the story to have levels of empathy and compassion because that's the mirror you want to hold up. Do you think that is a hard and fast rule that should be followed, that there should be a central purpose to what somebody should take away from whatever they're looking at, whether it's a book? Or is it a greater responsibility as an author than a filmmaker?
No, I think I would sort of back off from the notions of great responsibilities for authors. I mean, many authors write to entertain. But even in the writing of entertaining, you are in some fashion exploring the human condition. And so if you want to explore one small fragment of the human condition, that's, short stories, poetry, fiction, that is a perfectly viable and honorable approach to make, I think. So no, I would not start labeling and saying you got to have this in a story.
But does it make a better story if you do? Personal opinion.
I, as a reader, long before I was a writer, I was a reader, and my sense was, if I had the conviction that the author had given thought to those other aspects in the process, but then selected these aspects or those aspects, but not the whole thing, I was fine with that. I guess I looked for thoughtfulness and mindfulness in the writer. But at the same time, there are many writers who are what we call seat of the pants writers. They're gut instinct stuff. And the thing I've sort of come to realize is gut instincts are very, very accurate barometers. So if you can trust in it enough, you just run with it, and it should be okay.
Thoughtfulness.
Mindfulness.
Mindfulness,
Yeah.
that's a good one. Great. Well, I'm sure you're all sick of just hearing us talk. Should we open the floor up to questions?
Absolutely.
So we've got people with mics over here. If anyone's got a question on anything we've spoken about so far today, please feel free.
Not a single question. Wow. All right, Will.
Thank you.
Thanks, Will.
I mean, you can ask him anything. What does he think of Hong Kong? Where he got a fabulous shirt.
That was such a fascinating talk, so I want to thank you for that. My question is about genre overlaps and fantasy overlaps, and specifically what you think of Stephen King's fantasy novels.
I love them. I thought they were great. The only thing that I remember sort of feeling a bit uneasy about was Stephen King appearing in those novels. I think generally, though, I like the idea that he hinted at a potential alternate Earth in which all of his novels fit into one seamless whole. I think that was a really cool idea. But yes, I think I'm actually a big fan of Stephen King as a writer. He basically does what Spielberg did on film, and that he humanizes through very small gestures the characters that he creates. My only troubling aspect or disappointing aspect is he used to say, and I think he still does, never show the face of the monster, but then book after book, by the end of the last chapter, you get to see the monster. That kind of sucks. So I don't know if he pulls off endings, but man, can he write. Great writer.
Good afternoon. I'm Jerry from the Philippines.
Hello.
I'm a writer of young adult novels, actually, but I'm also an editor with the University Press. And I was very interested in your background as an archaeologist, because I've edited archaeology and anthropology books, and I've always thought of incorporating the knowledge that I gleaned from these books into my own fiction.
Absolutely.
Yes, and well, that's why one of the reasons I'm here. And how have you done that? How have you incorporated your archaeology in particular? Example is, I just finished editing a book on Philippine cemeteries, for example, in which the authors talked about artifacts and grave markers and how they revealed things about the people who were buried there and the people who buried them. And I'm thinking, okay, this would be great to incorporate in certain novels about the Spanish era, the Chinese era in the Philippines. How have you done that in your own fiction?
Yeah, it sounds like very similar to what you're doing. Archaeology sort of forces upon you the seeing things in the long term. So the rise and the fall of civilizations, and then seeing the mechanisms that bring those about. And so quite often a fantasy world will appear in a book as if it were static, as if it were fixed in place, as if technology never changed, and that apart from legends, there is no prehistory to that world. No history at all, in a sense. And then you have the classic conflict with the Dark Lord, and then the minions of the Dark Lord, and then the good guys defeat them, and then it all cycles around again. It's just this repetition of things. And so for the archaeology and for anthropology, the idea of a world in a dynamic world, a world that actually is evolving. And so as empires expand, for example, they come into contact with other cultures that have their own value systems, their own technological levels, their own maybe access to magic. And that clash is where your story comes from, because it is the clash of all cultures, all through time and all through history. And I did a lot of my work in Canada, where you just had to scrape the surface of the earth and you've left human history behind. There's very little that's been left behind. And so that idea of layering the world you're creating in a hidden and buried past, and then in the process of writing, you're basically excavating and you're revealing that past and how the bones of that past have shaped the surface of the world. And you can do that all the way through, for setting after setting. And it sort of infuses the place with a sense of time and time passing. And the fact that there are, you talk about the cemetery that you're talking about. For all you know, there may be burial mounds just nearby, that are Neolithic or even older. And so that sense of layering the world you're creating, for YA or for any genre, I think really does a lot to convince the reader that this is a real place, wherever it is.
Hi there. First of all, thank you for coming to Hong Kong and giving this talk. I actually have really fond memories of kind of geeking out over Malazan with my friends in my late teens, so this was a pleasure for me.
Do you live here?
No, I come from the UK.
From the UK, okay.
Yeah, so I moved here a couple of months ago. So I can ask you as many questions as you want. But I think I'll go with, you mentioned grimdark subgenre earlier. And that brought to mind like the Glenn Cook series on the Black Company.
Yeah, huge inspiration for me.
Yeah, so I was just going to ask, I saw the kind of parallel with the bridge burners that you have in Malazan, and you're kind of exploring, I guess, the other side of the coin. So yeah, I was just wondering, what kind of early works did you take, you and Ian take inspiration from? And was that wonderful?
Glenn Cook's Dread Empire and Black Company were massive inspirations. Stylistically, the other side would have been Stephen R. Donaldson's Thomas Covenant trilogies. So I kind of fused the two in terms of inspiration. The thing that I liked with Glenn Cook, and I'm hoping the television series when it comes, it will actually convey this. He's a Vietnam War veteran, and he was the first guy that I read who actually brought the Vietnam War sensibility of the soldier on the ground, keeping their heads down while the napalm was overhead, into fantasy. So that kind of ground level approach, I thought was simply amazing. And the frustrating thing was, at least the first time around, those books did not sell particularly well. And it has taken a long time for it to come around and people recognizing just how terrific they are. And I'm hoping the television series has the humor, because let's face it, most fantasy, epic fantasy on television is so humorless, it's frustrating beyond belief.
Yeah, I think that's actually what I appreciated about some of your characters, like brings to mind like the characters from the Leather Empire. You had the Beddick brothers and the kind of humor that was going on with that kind of dynamic with Mael and I think it was Tiol or something. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I appreciated the kind of characters, and I think also you just mentioned in the last answer you gave to the gentleman back there about layering a world from the kind of foundations of the past, the bones of the past, and bring it up to the kind of present day of the story. And I think that was quite in contrast to another world builder that I like, which is China Miéville. So I don't know if you've read many of his works, but
I have.
For him, it seems like his locations are almost have personalities rather than this kind of anthropological approach that you go with. And is that something that you see a contrast with? Or?
No, he's driven by ideas, right? And they tend to be overtly political. So a lot of what he writes serves the function of exploring those ideas and the political aspects of those ideas. Oddly enough, it was my first book signing ever was in Cambridge, alongside China when his, I think his first novel came out. So I met him, both of us were both completely sort of gobsmacked that we got published to begin with. And so, yeah. Thanks for reminding me of China. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, cool. I'd probably better give this mic to someone else for a...
Hello. I've got a bit of a chicken or the egg question related to planning. So when you write, because you have your anthropological...
Oh, sorry, the answer is the egg, by the way. But anyways,
so
go
I
ahead.
shouldn't ask my question. But yeah, do you come up with the plot for the story first and then build the world around that? Or do you come up with the world first and try to think, what kind of story could this world tell? And then go about it that way?
Yeah. I think whatever works for the writer. Bear in mind that, like I say, this was a role-played history. And oddly enough, everything we role-played became the background to the novels that we both wrote in the world. So they weren't the novels themselves. So they were, in a sense, laying the foundations for the history that we were going to then explore. And I would recommend to any beginning writer to role play and to run a game with half dozen people. Even if you've never done it before, figure out the rules and run the game. Because as you run a game as a dungeon master or game master, you are the narrator. You are providing all the physical world building details, but you have no control over those 6 characters. And that is a very humbling experience, which you can then apply when you're writing fiction, because characters will take off on you, and you can either fight it or you just run with them. And I recommend you run with them, because they will take you to interesting places, and you can always loop back to your plot. So my approach is, well, for the 10-book series, this is going to sound crazy. I had 3 scenes in my head that were in the final chapters of the 10th novel. They were in my head for close to 15 years, if not longer. And so for me, the process of writing was to get there before I died, basically. And to get to those scenes, because they were where all the emotional impact converged for the entire 10 books. And so it was a race against time to basically get there. And then when I got there, I got panicked because it had been in my head for so long, I didn't think I could pull it off on the page. But I did my best.
Thank you.
That's a great point to anyone who's a budding writer and a Dungeons & Dragons fan. I never considered just seeing how it plays out using that framework.
Yeah, you don't control your characters because they're played by other people. And so I think a writer needs that element of humility with their works. And if you acknowledge that, at least in your head, these characters are living, breathing people with their own wants, desires, and needs, you have to respect that. And so they will take you places. And that's part of the joy of writing, as far as I'm concerned. If I overplotted, I lose the interest. I need that spontaneity.
What a great way to keep yourself in check, keep the hubris at bay if you make somebody else do it. Fabulous. Any more? One more? 2 more?
Hi, so thank you for that really fascinating talk, but I'm actually more interested in your background in archaeology and anthropology.
Okay.
So I'm just wondering what you think about, well, how these 2 subject areas can contribute to our world, because they're such, narrow, they seem like such unconventional subjects. So I just want to hear your
The subjects of anthropology and archaeology?
Yeah, well,
Yeah?
well, I came to this talk and I saw the title Anthropology and World Building, so I thought it was about...
Are you a student of anthropology, or?
I'll be starting a course in anthropology and archaeology in September.
Cool. Have you decided on a specialty of any kind?
No.
No? Okay. Well, my university, unlike, say, the British system, where archaeology is derived from, well, antiquarianism, basically, and anthropology is a separate subject. My training, the major degree was in anthropology with the subdiscipline in archaeology. So, and my son's gone through to a master's degree in archaeology in the UK, and yet I can almost not talk with him about anthropology because he took no anthropology courses. And it just blows my mind that you could actually be an archaeologist without an anthropological background. So the fact that you're taking both is brilliant because one will inform the other, very much so. So you're asking about its relevance to the modern world?
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, man. Well, I guess, okay, with anthropology, what you will discover is the sheer vastness of the human condition. And that kind of sense, to me, it makes one optimistic. This is going to sound very strange. On Facebook, I got in. Occasionally, I kick a hornet's nest, and the hornet's nest is veganism, and whatever. These days, I'm almost baiting them on purpose. But there are cultures that are exclusively built around eating of meat. And yet, when you get sort of the more the vegans who are sort of fanatical about it, their argument seems to be they have to convince the entire world to convert to veganism. And as an anthropologist, I recoil because I love the diversity of cultures. I do not want to see a monochromatic kind of culture crossing the entire globe. And so, for me, then when I take something like a meat-eating culture, I can apply that to my fiction or whatever. But it allows me, at the same time, to see that there are other ways of living. There are other ways of dealing with the environment. There are other ways of managing that environment. And archaeology, on the other hand, depending on, okay, I would recommend, if you're going to become an archaeologist, specialize in a technology, not a place. So if you were to say to specialize in Anatolian Bronze Age, like my son did, no advice I could give him was going to actually get through to him. So he did the very opposite. That's what he specialized in. And the problem, of course, is your chances of getting onto a dig in Anatolia related to the Bronze Age are low to begin with. They get even worse if the country decides to close its borders to our archaeologists. So that basically can put you out of work. But if you specialize in rock art, if you specialize in stone tool technology, pottery, ceramics, you specialize in a technology, then that is transferable anywhere in the world. And so I remember digging up stone tools in northern Manitoba in Canada, virtually identical to the stone tools I was digging up in Belize and Central America, virtually identical to the ones I dug up in southern Italy, etc. And so that kind of skill you can transport. Usefulness, digs are awesome. If you can get on a dig, get on a dig. It's a great experience.
There's also social anthropology.
There is.
From if I could just throw a point in there from somebody who works in the commercial sector, when we're looking at how jobs are transforming and how the workplace is transforming, the sorts of people, the sorts of degrees that we're seeing from entry-level graduates and students, they're more diverse than they've ever been before. So if you want to go into marketing and you've got a degree in social anthropology, you will be snapped up. if you have any sort of leaning on behavioral science or have a keen understanding of how different cultures work, as the world becomes more globalized, it has so many uses, and not just from a commercial perspective, even going back to the base idea of empathy and having context that's not just Eurocentric. We were talking before this, and I was sort of telling Stephen about a trip that I recently took to Angkor Wat in Cambodia, and there I had this moment of realization, to my shame, of how much of my own education has been Eurocentric, having grown up in Hong Kong, that this is beautiful, 90 minutes away is this ancient civilization I knew almost nothing about, and yet I've known so much more about the ancient Egyptians or Mayan civilizations, and just so very little about Asia. So the collective knowledge that you can add to it from not just, from across the spectrum, whether it's social anthropology or straight up archaeology with Indiana Jonesing on, different digs, or Lara Crofting, I suppose. I personally believe there's a big, bright future out there for it, and more people should be in those fields, because it ultimately leads to more empathy and interconnectedness, which is, you can't go wrong with that.
Thank you.
Hi again. I've got another question, actually. So I think one of the most interesting things about Malazan was seeing how the magic system kind of required sacrifices from the people who wanted access to the power of the Warrens and so on. So I was just wondering, what other authors have come up with magic systems that you find really intriguing, and kind of who are you reading at the moment in terms of fantasy authors?
Okay, two confessions. One, I don't read fantasy anymore. I basically stopped many years ago, actually. Two, I don't like most magic systems as presented. And the reason is, if you create a magic system in which you spend hours creating the rules for, the mechanics of, and then you explain all that in your book, all the magic has done in your fantasy novel is replace the technology. And my sense is magic actually has a different function in narrative, and it is to evoke the sense of wonder and mystery. Therefore, I will never explain the magic in the Malazan world, nor will Cam, because it is serving a literary function, it's serving a literary purpose. That mystery needs to exist. And too much of our sort of mechanistic Newtonian approach to the world is to explain absolutely everything. And by explaining it, in a sense, you explain it away as well. And so, no, magic has a function. It has a function.
So, like, it seems like you, I guess, coming from your background as an anthropologist, you kind of evoke that spiritual and religious experience with relation to the magic in Malazan anyway. So with the Warrens and the Holds, they seem very kind of, I guess, archetypal locations where power exists. Was that like a conscious decision that
it's sort of built up? I mean,
sort of
a lot of game systems employ the four elements. So you get magic of air, fire, water, and earth. And I think we found that a bit limiting, and so we created sort of other elements like time, life, death. And then for the purposes of the gaming, we came upon a tarot system, so our deck of dragons derived from this. And it just sort of built itself up organically. And in other words, all of those things are elements by which the characters within that world interact with the unknowable. And that just, again, it serves that particular function.
Do you guys still have your GURPS game going at the moment, or?
No, I haven't gamed. I found that if I'm gaming, I'm drawing from the same creative well as writing. And so writing pays, gaming doesn't. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. One more?
Can you please share a little bit more, a little bit about your co-creating experience, working with someone else to create something? Because, as you said about the point of view, one character, one person will have one point of view, and then another character, another person will have a completely different point of view. So I'm curious about how did you actually come to agree on certain things? Or
Great question.
Well, yeah. One of the things we agreed on earlier, as early as we possibly could, was if we moved into fiction, and we started out writing a screenplay of this stuff, a feature film, which has since been lost, that he would handle certain aspects of the history, and I would handle other areas. So there'd be geographical separation. There'd be some crossover of character every now and then, but we had, I don't know if you've read the books, but we had thousands of characters. So, and then he was running games where I played 2 or 3 characters, and he played the NPCs, the non-player characters, and drove the narrative. And then we'd switch over and just very unusual role-playing games, because for about half of it, it was just 2 people, me and Cam. And quite often we'd have entire gaming sessions where nobody pulled a weapon out because it was all conversation. And that was finding the voices of the characters, finding the situations they were in. And then since then, he contacts me maybe while he's writing a book, maybe twice, 3 times. The only clashes we've ever had is the fact that he's left-handed and I'm right-handed, so he visualizes everything the opposite of what I do. And you know, when you're doing city streets and that kind of stuff, then we have to go to the maps, because he's got it the other way around, or I've got it the other way around. But no, generally, I've left him to explore what he wants to explore, and he's just finished a trilogy, which is the foundation of the Empire, and I know he's signed for another trilogy, which will bring him up to the beginning of my novel, Gardens of the Moon. So it's going to go full circle.
thank you.
Yep. Oh, just to add to that, the big test was how are we going to match as writers? And fortunately, I mean, stylistically, we're very different. But because we're writing out of the same world, we both capture the same atmosphere and tone.
Can you tell when you
Oh,
look
yeah.
back? You can tell?
Yeah.
Can you tell? Yeah? That's super interesting.
But quite often readers can't tell which characters I played versus which
Right.
characters Cam played. Yeah.
Cool. I think we can end on that point then.
Okay.
Thank you so much for a truly fascinating discussion.
Well, thank you. Thanks for your questions.